Good evening, everyone. Last night at sunset, under the appropriate darkness of the new moon, we began the 9 days, the final period before Tisha B'Av. These days, especially the 9th of Av, are the saddest and most severe days of our yearly calendar. On Tisha B'Av, we recollect cycles of destruction, captivity, persecution, and exile stretching over more than 2,000 years. Every year, I face trepidation at these days, not only because of fear. The world and the human propensity for hate sadly have not changed, but even more because they lead me to the hardest questions about God and divine justice. Every year I struggle with the questions, and I'm never satisfied with my answers. But perhaps it is the struggle that God wants. Sometimes it is healthy to be angry and to even yell, both at God and humanity. This week's Haftorah from Isaiah is just such a scream. Isaiah cries out, warning our ancestors of impending doom. Though he speaks in God's words, it is not hard to feel his despair with humanity and even with God. Humanity for its failures, which lead to the necessity that God take action and bring destruction. Isaiah looks at his community and sees piety without inner meaning, reverence which is not transformative. People worship and bring sacrifices to the temple, and yet there are homeless still on the streets of Jerusalem, and the widow and orphan still starve. Isaiah despairs because for the people, the Torah is just words, divarim, leading to theatrics rather than real change. The prophet challenges us in these words: listen to do good, devote yourselves to justice and aid the wronged, uphold the rights of the orphan, and defend the cause of the widow. As I read these words from Isaiah, I am always struck again with despair. After more than 2,500 years, the world is still very much the same. The homeless still fill the streets, and poverty remains endemic across the globe. The challenge for transformation remains the same then as it did now. Our ancient rabbis add an additional level to my disquiet on Tisha B'Av. They question the difference between the destruction of the two temples. They wonder why it took less than 100 years to rebuild the second temple after the first was destroyed. But following the destruction of the second, centuries have now passed with no end in sight. Even thousands of years ago, the answer they provided is devastating. The first temple, they suggest, differing in reason from Isaiah, it was destroyed, they say, because of idolatry, a sin of humanity against God. The just punishment for this sin was the short exile between the two temples. However, they bring forward two very different sins which led to the destruction, they suggest, of the second temple. Namely, sinat hinam, intercommunal hatred, and a lack of derech eretz, a basic respect and care for others. Both of these are the sins of humanity against humanity. And the rabbis explain that the temple cannot and will not be rebuilt until these sins vanish from the earth. They understood too well the difficulty of this challenge, and today it is clear that humanity still has a lot of work to do. Indeed, returning to the United States after 17 years from first Canada and then Japan, especially in the midst of this COVID pandemic, it's clear that these are existential challenges to our country. Fissures caused by racism and bigotry literally sinat hinam, divide our society and lead to widespread and significant protests across the nation. Protests we need to hear. I've also been shocked at the prejudice aimed at people of Asian descent here in the States and across the globe. It is too easy to scapegoat others, solving nothing but engendering hate, something we as Jews have experienced too often. Healing through the recognition of necessary change may be difficult, but it is essential in order for us to be one nation again, or maybe for the first time. Isaiah reminded us about justice in antiquity, and only our actions will allow it to well up like a mighty stream. As a society, we also face the challenge of derech eretz, how we choose to treat others. From a distance, and now up close, it is clear that many Americans care more for our individual rights and freedoms rather than for our obligations to the people with whom we live. It is strange to me, coming from Japan, where masks have been a norm long before COVID-19, how they have become politicized here in the United States of America. Wearing a mask correctly is an essential act of derech eretz, an act of care and love. We do it primarily not to protect ourselves, but to protect others. Whereas social distancing, which is equally important, is an act of mutuality. We protect others as they protect us. But both are not attacks on freedom or individual rights, but instead are essential reminders that we don't exist in isolation, but rather as part of a greater community, a greater human community. In Judaism, the freedom of Egypt is always tied to the obligation of Sinai. As Hillel reminds us, if I am only for myself, what am I?